Well, the former President Donald Trump has dismissed calls for him to take on the role of Speaker of the House of Representatives. Republicans are scrambling to find a replacement after Kevin McCarthy was spectacularly ousted yesterday. Let's bring in live now Gordon Flake. He's the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre. Gordon, good to see you for our Australian audience. Just give us a sense of how big a deal this was to see a Speaker ousted in such a dramatic fashion.
Well, I would say the Australians have far more experience this than Americans do. They're not quite used to leadership spills, if you will. We don't even have the vocabulary in the United States for something like this. It's such a rare occurrence to have a Speaker of the House of Representatives deposed by his own party. And so we're really in untested waters. It's important because obviously it shows to the world how dysfunctional at least the Republican majority in the House of Representatives is right now. It's had an immediate impact on funding for Ukraine, and it really kind of makes people, I think, increasingly anxious about the ability of the government, or at least of the Congress, to move forward to fund the U.S. government. Remember, the previous Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, lost his job over his willingness to make a compromise to keep the funding of the federal government going for a short gap period of 45 days. And so 43 days from now, that runs out, and whoever comes in his stead is going to have to figure out that challenge, which obviously cost the previous speaker his job.
You use the word dysfunctional. To what extent can the House function without a speaker?
Well, I think they're going to move very quickly to get a replacement, just because they have an acting speaker right now. I don't know that an acting speaker has that much less authority than Kevin McCarthy did. You will recall that he was only elected speaker after a historic 15 ballots and after making a series of promises to a very focused group of what you would call extreme MAGA Republicans, particularly boisterous adherents of the former President Donald Trump, who made a series of demands on him and then ultimately were not satisfied that he kept his promises and those demands, and then led to his ousters. But this really was a failure of the Republican Party with a relatively narrow 4-seat majority to hold on to its own leadership or to come to some degree of continuity within the party itself. It's not an indication of dysfunction within the House or the Congress itself. It's the leadership party.
And in terms of front runners now to take on that role, where's that seeming to land today, and what would it say about the Republicans in terms of who gets picked?
So it looks like the two leading candidates are two other congressmen who have already been in the leadership. Steve Scalise, who's, again, of poor health. You may recall about a decade ago, he was a victim in a horrific shooting at a baseball game in Washington, D.C. He's now suffering from blood cancer, but says he's well enough to take up the job. Hard conservative, but he's considered to be a bit more of a traditionalist. He was the Republican whip, the deputy under Speaker McCarthy. The other one is Jim Jordan, former wrestling coach out of Ohio, who's been a real firebrand. He led the Weaponization of Government Committee and is probably favored by those on the right. I think in terms of conservatism and policy positions, there's very little difference between the two of them, but there is a big difference in terms of approach. They seem to be the leading candidates. I think probably when you talk about questions like Ukraine and keeping the government funding, there's probably a slight presumption that Steve Scalise would be more of an institutionalist, and that Jim Jordan would be more of a bomb thrower, somebody who's like the 8 rebels who brought down the previous speaker, more inclined towards chaos and performative art rather than governance.
Interesting to see some commentary in the US about how McCarthy didn't turn to Donald Trump for help to try and help him hold on to the speakership. Those two have a pretty complicated up and down relationship over the years, by the looks of it, as a lot of people have had with the former president. On Donald Trump, I see that his campaign has announced that they've raised $45.5 million in campaign funding. It triples the efforts of its closest rival for the nomination, Ron DeSantis. He really seems to be continuing that momentum going despite all of the legal challenges that we're reporting on almost daily at the moment.
So one thing that I think every Republican has begun to realize over the last 5 years is that with Donald Trump, loyalty is a one-way street. So one of the things that really got the ire of Democrats is the decision by Kevin McCarthy after harshly criticizing the actions of the former president around the insurrection on January 6th and the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Within a week, he had gone down to Florida to make up and kiss the ring. That's what got him the speakership, but that wasn't sufficient to get him, ongoing support from those very, very Trumpist allies of him. In the end, every Republican in the House today is a Trumpist Republican. All of them are, and I would make the distinction between those who support Trump out of fear and those who support Trump out of the fact that he's, they're idle and they are pursuing Trumpist policies. And that's going to be the real contest for the leadership. You're right, when it comes to the elections, Donald Trump continues to have a commanding lead in the primaries. The debates thus far have been a contest to see who might be second place. But given the amount of time between now and the election, and given the challenges, legal and otherwise, that the former president is facing, it's not a bad position to be in as the second most likely presumptive candidate if something indeed does happen to Donald Trump between now and then.
I just wanted to ask you before you go, Gordon, about the report we just had earlier from Olivia Casely about these concerns about the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's out-of-play of plane flying him to China. Is that fair to assume that China would be interested in hacking the plane of a Prime Minister they've invited to visit?
Yes, I think it's been long standard practice among business executives and government officials is that you never take sensitive cell phones or laptops anywhere into China because there's a presumption they will be hacked. The same probably applies to communications equipment. If it's sitting on the tarmac, my presumption is that whether it's Air Force One or the Australian Prime Minister's plane, that we've got the capability to do some type of shielding, if nothing else, just turning it off while we have staff stay with the plane on the tarmac. So I'm not quite as alarmed about it as that reporting suggests, but I honestly just don't know the technical side of things. I am sure that there are workarounds. This is obviously an important political symbol in terms of the 50th anniversary of Gough Whitlam's trip. It's one that missing it would have some consequences. But obviously, this report highlights the fundamental challenges that Australia is going to face in trying to find a new normal with China when there's some real serious doubts about their behavior and intelligence and in security in the region writ large.
Gordon Flake, always appreciate your analysis. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.